welcome to today's lecture on the birth of Egypt. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to dive into one of the most fascinating and mysterious cultures ever to grace the face of the earth. In particular, we'll look at how it all got started and how the Nile River played an absolutely crucial role in first separating and then uniting the cultures of ancient Egypt. So, whether you're looking to become a pharaoh or would rather hang out with Osiris and the gods, journey with me as we investigate the birth of ancient Egypt.
Ever since the pyramids were constructed nearly 5,000 years ago, mankind has been fascinated with ancient Egypt and its mysteries. And a brief glance at the archaeological remains that ancient Egyptians have left behind makes it obvious why that's the case. Massive pyramids rise into the heavens, quite literally the only one of the ancient wonders of the world that can be seen from outer space. Golden jewelry, statues, and of course burial masks lay untouched for millennia in rock-cut tombs. And the remains of the pharaohs themselves are preserved to this day through a sophisticated process of mummification.
Now, one of the incredibly cool things about ancient Egypt is that everyone has some sort of conception of it. Pyramids and mummies, burial masks and temples. But what's even cooler, at least in my opinion, is what all these amazing sites and artifacts are representative of. A culture that lasted for more than 3,000 years. That's like twice as long as the time between the present day and the fall of ancient Rome. Simply incredible.
Now, we're not unique with our fascination of ancient Egypt. Some of history's most famous civilizations, the ancient Greeks and the Romans, had their own obsession with the mysteries of the Nile. Greek sculpture, for instance, is taken directly from the forms created in ancient Egypt. And Roman burials often evoke the pyramids as tombs for its imperial aristocracy. So before ancient Egypt ever actually fell, its influence was already spreading throughout the known world.
On our journey together, we'll investigate just how the pharaoh helped make Egypt one of the longest lasting, most successful cultures ever. And in doing so, we'll explore all those things that make Egypt so famous, pyramids and mummies. And we'll see how these things were utilized to empower the king to create social stability.
Herodotus is often known as the father of history. He was a Greek writer in the 5th century BCE, and he often came up with incredibly elaborate tales that were more myth than history. He says that in Persia, for instance, there were giant furry ants the size of foxes, which sprinkled golden dust particles as they dig into the ground. Locals would then collect this dust, and that's one of the reasons the Persian Empire was so wealthy. Just in case this seems plausible to you, he always says that these ants were carnivores, and they would chase down and eat camels.
So this is obviously ludicrous, likely a misunderstanding of Herodotus' Persian sources. But Herodotus wasn't always wrong, and when in Book 2 of his histories, he calls Egypt, quote-unquote, the gift of the Nile, he couldn't have been more right. Everything in ancient Egypt, the pyramids and mummies and pharaohs, the entirety of its complex civilization is the result of the Nile River.
The Nile River flows from south to north, covering a distance of more than 4,000 miles, and eventually emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. Because it flows this direction, the southern part of Egypt is known as Upper Egypt, because it's upriver, and the northern part of Egypt is known as Lower Egypt, because it's downriver. While most of the Nile River is fairly navigable by boat, there are a series of rapids, or cataracts, in the southern part of the country, which prevented large ships from heading down from the Sudan, or ancient Nubia, north into Egypt.
Now, Egypt was protected from the east and west as well. When you look at a satellite image of Egypt and the Nile, you can see how sharp the distinction is between the barren desert and the fertile Nile River Valley. The Egyptians called the fertile area Kemet, which literally translates as the black land because of the color of the rich soil. And they called the barren area Deshret, or the red land. And this word Deshret eventually turned into our word desert, and is one of the few words we have in English that descends from the ancient Egyptian language.
To get a sense for how Egypt rose from a series of small villages into the soaring state that produced the pyramids, it's necessary to get a sense for the deep history of the region. Humans, well, actually the ancestors of modern humans, inhabited the region more than 500,000 years ago. As modern humans replaced their hominid ancestors, they moved into the Nile River Valley around 100,000 years ago. Since then, populations have lived off the fruits of the Nile River and the floods that allow for agriculture.
This flooding was incredibly important. Every year in the summer, there would be these massive monsoons in the highlands south of Egypt. And they would carry water and, most importantly, silt down the Nile River, causing it to flood annually. And these floods then deposited rich soil in the floodplain around the river, and this area became massively productive when it came to growing crops. During the entire peak of Egyptian civilization, it was this flooding and the agriculture that resulted from it that allowed Egypt to thrive.
But all that agriculture was a relatively recent phenomenon. For tens of thousands of years, basically the entire history of humans up until around 10,000 years ago, people didn't farm at all. They hunted wildlife and they foraged for food that grew naturally within the environment. While the Nile floods still helped produce useful plants, it was more of a natural phenomenon and less of something intentionally created by humans.
What this all means is that for the vast majority of human history, something like 95% of the time people have existed, life has been pretty similar for most people in most places. They'd spend most of their time trying to find food and shelter and not get eaten by lions and tigers and hippopotamuses, especially if you're in Egypt. And that obviously raises the question about what set Egypt down a different path from the rest of the world? Why was it the one to emerge so early?
Starting around 5000 BCE, distinct cultures began to develop in different parts of Egypt. It's no coincidence, of course, that this happened right around the same time that ancient Egypt settled down, stopped hunting and gathering, and started farming. After this occurred, regions in the south, in Upper Egypt, started to look a little different than regions in the north, in Lower Egypt. We tend to have more evidence of this from Upper Egypt because there was less silt deposited there, and thus the finds are easier to access.
The exact specifics of the cultural names and dates are more detailed than we need to be right now. But it is important to know that it's after the introduction of farming that we begin to get regional differentiation within Egypt. We also begin to get evidence of a sophisticated material culture that seems to have at least some connections to the larger Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds.
Perhaps the most important site of the 4th millennium BCE, that is the 3000s BCE, is Naqada, near the bend in the river where the later towns of Thebes and Karnak and Luxor would thrive. At Naqada, we begin to get well-crafted pottery. First, a highly burnished black-topped redware distinctive within Egypt. After that, we get the development of iconography on pottery, with red lines denoting people and animals and ships. And looking quite similar to pottery you might find later in the Greek Bronze Age.
Most impressive of all is the stone and ivory work of the late 4th millennium BCE. Here we get the emergence of some extremely finely crafted stone blades, knapped with impeccable precision. Their handles were carved with the images of rulers and animals. And this one, perhaps the most famous, comes from Jebel Iraq and depicts a Near Eastern style king exerting control over massive animals, symbolizing the king's power over nature. At the same time, palettes, or stone-carved makeup trays, began to be elaborately carved with the symbols of rulership and power. These were all signs that egalitarian life was giving way to a stratified society.
It's tough to know specifics about this early time because writing hadn't fully emerged. But evidence from a tomb at Abydos in Upper Egypt in the south starts to tell us about the unification process. One of the early tombs at the site is known as UJ, and although the general cemetery was looted in antiquity, modern archaeologists were able to find artifacts the looters missed. Among these were a series of ceramic vessels which depicted syrinx, decorated facades that contained images of a scorpion.
We know from later burials that these syrinx depict the names of early Egyptian kings. Like right here with this snake, we see the syrinx of Jet with Horus, the god of kingship, above the syrinx. We also see that this particular tomb was far wealthier than the others around it. It was huge and had 12 rooms, and it contained hundreds of jars of beer and wine, which was particularly impressive because it had to be imported. Perhaps most importantly, it contains small ivory plaques with hieroglyphs, which some scholars believe is our earliest evidence for writing in Egypt.
So the Scorpion King may have actually been a real person. What's more, there may have been two of them. Another archaeological find dates to about 100 years later, sometime just before 3000 BCE. This was a ceremonial mace head, and a mace is a weapon you'd normally use to beat people upside the head with. On this mace head, we get a king, marked by the white crown of Upper Egypt, and the hieroglyph of a scorpion is placed right next to his head.
Now, scholars debate who this guy actually was. Most agree that he's different from the Scorpion King of Tomb UJ, but nonetheless he's important. Some identify him with Narmer, sometimes thought to be the first king of a united Egypt. Others identify him as the enemy of Narmer, and we'll learn more about that guy as we continue with this course. Regardless of the Scorpion King's actual identity, one of the important things is that he holds a pick, ready to start irrigating. This is monumentally important because it gives us a sense for how and why Egypt grew the way it did. Irrigation gave people a reason to come and work together, and it gave people a need for management. With that management, eventually they became the political elite. So, next time you're trying to start a complex civilization, let the waters of the Nile do your work for you. Control irrigation, and you control the people. And you can put them on the path to a civilization that will be, in its day, the greatest in the world. Just a couple lessons you can learn from
The Birth of Ancient Egypt.